stand on the shoulder of giants. That's a concept we explored in our last episode, where we talked about what it takes to actually progress spiritually. We explored how important it is to go on a path that's been well traveled before by guides, by other spiritual aspirants just like you. In this episode, we're going to talk about what it takes to go down that path, the challenges we face on this path, and what we can do to overcome it. Different ways of looking at the spiritual path itself. Namaste and welcome. This is the Dharmic Life Podcast on the BAPS Better Living channel. And I'm your host, Dhawal, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Kashyap and Rashmi. And I'm going to get right into this topic right now. We talked a lot in our previous episode about what it takes to walk on a guided path, but let's call a spade a spade. When we are saying a guided path, we're talking about organized religion. And I think that word itself can be quite confusing. And so from your perspective, I'd like to know from the two of you, what do you see the word organized religion to mean from maybe your own lived experience or maybe from a more kind of, definitional understanding of what organized religion is?
When people talk about organized religion, they immediately think about megachurches, massive institutions and organizations, the things that we see in the media and the press, the giant monoliths that we see when we go to these big cities throughout the world for different religions, and we visit their tourist sites. But I think we need to take a step back from the monolith, from the structure, and think about what an organized religion actually is. My definition of an organized religion is a prescribed path with built-in scriptures, guidance, rules of engagement and organization that allows a seeker of spirituality to follow that path and hopefully achieve what they're looking for.
I think it's a good distinction you made as well, Kashyap, where a lot of times, I think you're right. People immediately think organized religion and they associate that with the institution, and the institution's a piece of it. But you've highlighted some things that are also part of what organized religion is, which is a system, a structured set of beliefs, and a path that's intended to lead to a very specific outcome spiritually. And so all of those things, along with the institution or along with a spiritual place of practice, spiritual place of worship, all of that together, in my mind, just double clicking on what you said, that's what I also would consider organized religion.
I think three simple things for me that an organized religion would provide is some level of guidance, some level of identity/community. And then in addition to that, overlaid on top of that is a sense of accountability, a sense of friction to the individual that allows them to evolve and change. Because without friction, without resistance, you really don't evolve.
And I think it's worthwhile to discuss that in the absence of this, if you want to go down the spiritual path yourself, you really have, I would think, two groups of people or two different ways of doing it. You get group number one that says, well, I don't believe in religion at all. So you've got agnostics, atheists, that type of way of looking at the world. And then you've got a second path where you say, I'm spiritual, but I'll do it my own way. So this idea of rugged individualism, we've talked about that in previous episodes. And I think they both sound good in theory until life actually hits you. And you do end up craving the community. You do end up craving the accountability. You want that guidance. And so let's actually go in that direction. Why is doing it your own way? And this might be a bit of a recap from our previous episode, but why is doing it your own way, a do-it-yourself form of spirituality, why doesn't it actually fully work? Why doesn't it feel that fulfilling? Or why might it feel fulfilling on the surface, but actually is disguising something more?
Quite simply, what you defined is this argument of collectivism in spirituality versus individualism, rugged individualism. And the latter, especially from a Western lens, is really kind of what we lean into, the idea of the individual, freedom of choice, freedom of action, volition. But rugged individualism in spirituality requires a couple of things, that people are fundamentally self-aware, that we act consistently, that we will choose virtue, the high road, even when it's costly, and that we don't rationalize selfishness. But my experience in the world is that left alone, people will drift towards convenience and not necessarily virtue. And that's my argument against rugged individualism when it comes to treading the spiritual path.
If we close our eyes and think of what spirituality is, it's usually someone on a mountaintop in a dhyan mudra and there's a sunset behind them, right? That's like the idyllic picture of what spirituality is. And that's kind of what nivritti is meant to be, or that's what people think nivritti is. And nivritti is more, I'm going to disassociate myself from society, and I'm going to disassociate myself from external surroundings, and I'm going to turn inwards and, seek the soul, seek that. On the flip side, there's pravritti, which in the spiritual context typically means like, either some people can define it as you're doing your day-to-day life in society, fulfilling your responsibilities as a householder or whatever stage of life you're in. But in a more spiritual context, it can also mean kind of what we associate as religion, which is being a part of an institution, going to a place of worship, participating in the activities, discussing and engaging with fellow practitioners. And that's kind of also what pravritti is. In Hinduism, or at least in my study of it, there's another tenet that's kind of critical in the middle of both of those things. And that is the guru-shishya relationship, a spiritual master and a seeker, and the relationship between both. And if you try to traverse either path, pravritti or nivritti, without the guru, without a spiritual master, you're likely to not get to a fulfilling outcome. And the reason for that is kind of what you were saying, Kashyap, which is if I go about it my own way, my natural base instincts, I'm going to lean into that. It's convenient, always, right? Everyone's always going to lean into what is the most convenient for them. You're going to lean into the part of you that has the least friction. And so both paths, either it's the spiritual kind of nivritti path or the more structured religious pravritti path, you have to have a guru who helps you traverse both. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting in Hinduism is because you want to be surrounded by like-minded people, you benefit by, we use the word satsang or sang often in Hinduism or in Sanatan Dharma. There's a reason for that. There's a value of having spiritual aspirants that are like-minded around you because you benefit from that, from having them around. You also have some friction. There's a mirror put up to you. You have something to kind of try to aspire to. And so you have to have both sides. There's a pravritti path that's super valuable in helping you move forward. And then within that pravritti path, there's a nivritti path where you go inwards and you try to align yourself spiritually to the practices, to the beliefs as well. And so I think both are needed. And to your point, Kashyap, if we pick a path and try to do it our own way, you're likely to end up where you start.
Just to increase the aperture a little bit from what you said, making it a little bit more broad. The reason human beings, Homo sapiens, are the dominant species on this planet is not because we're the fastest, the strongest, have the sharpest teeth, that we can swim underwater and breathe, that we can fly in the sky like birds. It's because we collaborate. It's because we come together. And a human being could never take down a woolly mammoth going back 50 or 100,000 years, but a group of humans working together could. A single human could never build a high-rise, a skyscraper. A single human could never build a plane on his own, not to the scale that we currently travel in. So the idea that organization and collaboration in religion is not important is not really supported by every other field of endeavor that humans have thrived in. So that's the first thing. The second thing is individualism is important, but as we discussed in our previous podcast, I can get a public library card, or I can go online and I can find all the information in all of the world. Yet if I don't go through the appropriate training, you wouldn't necessarily let me design your home if I'm not a certified architect. You would not necessarily expect me or trust me to operate on your brain if I'm not a board certified neurosurgeon, and so on and so forth. So the list goes on and on and on. So we've already pretty much live under the premise that we expect a certain level of structure and guidance in everything else we do. We have to take a 16-year-old has to take a driver's exam before we put them behind a wheel. So why would religion or spirituality be any different?
Well, I'll push back a little bit because the argument against that is that, well, spirituality, you can talk about becoming a doctor, an architect, whatever it might be, and you need an organized path, some structure because you're interacting with other people. You need that license because you're operating on someone else. But spirituality is something that is very personal. And so there's this idea that, well, if it's that personal, it's that internal, then I should be able to just make it into a completely internal process. And I think it's worthwhile to distinguish this idea of we talked about rugged individualism. I think it's more of pathological individualism where your blind spots prevent you from going inside. And this whole idea of an organized religion is that, yes, your growth is internal. Obviously, that's what's happening. But because you're not walking alone. You're walking within a structured path so that you can grow internally. It's worthwhile to make that distinct because it seems very internal and yet still seems so social. And that can be a bit of a conundrum, but I think that's how you kind of reconcile those two sides.
I think what you're hitting on is the idea that I'm an individual. Why do you want to change that? I can find my own way. This is my lived reality. And I don't want to lose myself, right? That's the question, right? I join an organization, I join a group of people, and I lose myself. And I don't want to lose myself. And that sounds really nice, but we have to think about what version of myself am I really protecting? Because quite honestly, each of us can be better in our own particular ways. And most of us aren't fully formed physically, mentally, spiritually. We're reactive, we're inconsistent, we're emotional, we're distracted. So the idea that I figured it out, outside of a handful of people in our historical books that I can think of that were driven and intelligent and capable and enlightened enough to do it on their own, the rest of us, I think, are doomed to failure to some level, or we won't achieve the success or the heights that we should achieve if we try to do it on our own.
So here's the conundrum, right? Enter a structured path in organized religion, and you come with the best of intentions. You come with questions. You come with this deep desire for a spiritual experience, maybe a spiritual state itself, looking for enlightenment. And then you come here, you've got questions about, why does God create suffering? Why do good things happen to bad people? You have all of these very big conceptual questions, and it almost feels like sometimes you have to put all those questions aside because you're given a path. You're said, just do this, do A, B, C, D, E. And then you start asking questions like, well, why do I have to turn these with beads? Why do I need to wave a lamp around these sacred images of God 5 times a day or twice a day or whatever it might be? And again, getting answers to those questions feels inaccessible. It feels like I'm being told to put my mind aside. And so is that true? Doesn't an organized religion make you want to shut off your brain? And is that in the best interest of spiritual growth? What do you guys think?
It's a really good question, Dhawal, and I think it's one that a lot of people who grew up practicing religion face later on in life, where they're like, they grew up doing certain spiritual practices because maybe their parents told them to, or they grew up in that community, and then they question it down the road. And then it's kind of like, it's a crisis of faith, or people ask you to like, hey, don't worry about it. You're asking the wrong questions. And so you're asked to your point, like people feel like you're asked to turn off your brain or turn off your mind or believe something blindly. But actually, if you look at Hinduism and Sanatan Dharma and our historical scriptures and the practice of Hinduism, the Q&A, asking questions, going deep, it's a part of our spiritual lineage, right? If you look at the Upanishads, it's Q&A between gurus and shishyas, right? It's if you look at the Gita, it's literally Arjun asking Krishna Bhagavan questions on the battlefield, very deep, significantly spiritual questions. If you look at the Vachanamrut from the Swaminarayan practice, you see the same thing. It's, spiritual aspirants asking questions to God and trying to seek these deep, meaningful answers. And if you look at any of the scriptures, no question's a bad question, right? And the guru or Bhagwan in certain scriptures, Krishna Bhagwan or Bhagwan Swaminarayan, they're taking the time to answer those questions because they recognize that questions are the stepping stones to gaining spiritual maturity. They don't shun the idea of asking a question. Krishna at no point in the Gita goes, Arjun, that's a dumb question. Stop asking. Just do what at some point that does come up where you say, you have to surrender your mind, but it's after you have fulfilling answers to questions that you have, and I think that's a big part of our Hindu dharma. We at no point is it said, don't ask questions. In fact, I think the more important part is who are you asking those questions to? And that's a significant part of our scriptures is the spiritual aspirants are asking spiritual masters. A shishya is asking Bhagwan himself, God himself. And that is a very important part of the Q&A, lineage of Hinduism as well.
I think that's a great point. And this idea of questions and answers, it's an underrated, aspect of organized religion, of faith. I believe I belong to the Hindu faith, and it's that lens that I look at organized religion through. But in my experience, questions or doubts are not the enemy of religion, of faith. It's the engine of it. Everything is a Q&A. And, part of the process of being a part of this community is learning from those around me about so many reasons why we do the things we do. Sometimes it just seems like blind faith, a blind act. But if I take a step back and think about it, if I can't answer it myself, I have people around me that can answer those questions. So that's the value of community and the value of questioning. Doubt in faith is really not a bug. It's a feature of it. It's what pushes us forward if we're authentic and sincere in terms of our pursuit. One other thing I'd like to add to that is actually the idea of Q&A. This is not just kind of something historical in legacy books, but as members of our faith are well aware, today, contemporarily in 2026, you can write a letter to a guru, and it can be a question of spirituality, of philosophy. It could be a question of education. It can be a question of family. It could be a question of business, and get an honest, genuine response on any of those things. So this culture and this belief of questioning and seeking answers still exists today.
So I want to move on to another point, and we can't avoid this point. Because people often say when it comes to organized religion that it's hypocritical, that there are scandals in organized religion, people feel excluded, it kills individuality. And I know we touched on that a little bit earlier on. What do we do with that, right? Because it certainly seems fair. I've had my experiences of people who say one thing and do another. They say, they don't necessarily walk the talk. They say, do as I talk, not as I do itself. Is that a valid concern? Does it actually happen? How do you deal with the hypocrisy that you encounter in organized religion?
It's real. And I think we have to be very honest about that. Any organization, any system that centralizes authority to some level, that claims some level of legitimacy, and may deal with vulnerable people, may attract some bad actors. And that's true about every organization and every system that exists in mankind. Religion isn't unique or special here. It's older and it's more visible, and it gets a lot of press. But human problems expressed through institutions is not necessarily proof that the institution is not necessary. So, for example, if you look at medicine, we all know of malpractice cases we all know of bad providers, bad surgeons, bad physicians that may do things for personal gain or may do things inappropriately for not good reasons in terms of care of the patient that's there in front of them. But despite us knowing that, if I were to fall off a ladder and break my leg and a bone was taken out of my leg, I'm not thinking of the media and the bad practices. I'm telling my family and friends, please get me to the hospital as quickly as possible because I need my leg fixed. Education can collapse. We've seen academic exploitation at multiple levels. Families can collapse. A significant number of marriages end in divorce. Children become estranged from their parents. That doesn't mean families are not important. Governments collapse, right? We can go through history, decade after decade, not even looking at centuries, just looking at every single decade and see how governments have exploited their people, have assassinated and killed scores and scores, millions of people over time, people from other countries and people of their own countries within their own borders. But that doesn't mean governments aren't important. So the idea that, we abolish systems because we can find cases of abuse is really not fair when you say exclusively just for religion, but everything else will still let slide.
And adding on that, Kashyap, I think you made a point that's very valid is a lot of times these stories, the scandals, or, some of these things that we see, they gain a lot of traction just because they're sensational. And I think of it as more, when you're on a road, there's going to be certain signals and indicators that tell you to, hey, there's a pothole here, there's construction going on here, there's something that, avoid this path because it's going to be on I think of it as more of like a hazard signal, but I don't think it's the majority of the case, right? Like there's maybe one bad actor or one, scenario like that. That doesn't mean the whole institution, to your point, can be painted with that brush. If I had one bad experience or hear about a bad experience with a restaurant, that doesn't mean all restaurants are bad. I'm never going to go eat at a restaurant. That just means I have to make sure that I'm aware of what I'm trying to avoid or be cautious and be mindful of what I'm really looking for.
I think your point about, looking at the road signs is really important. You think back to certain, tragedies in organized religion. You think of the Jamestown massacre, where the leader of that faith, he put cyanide in the Kool-Aid. That's where the term, don't drink the Kool-Aid, comes from. He put cyanide in the Kool-Aid and over 900 of his followers died because they believed him. You think of the Branch Davidians and what happened in Waco, Texas. You think of just so many examples. But that doesn't mean that people of good faith are coming together exclusively to cause harm to others. That's just not a true statement. That's not my experience.
It's almost like the question is it perfect? I think the question is it valuable? And to discount an organized religion, a structured path because of some bad actors is ingenuine. It does not, you're missing out on something quite vast and something that can really support you by just looking at the bad apples, the bad spots. I think that's a really worthwhile point.
The idea that abuse only exists in collectives is really not a fair statement. So as an individual, people abuse themselves all the time, whether it's through eating bad food, whether it's drinking alcohol, whether it's doing drugs, or whatever it may be, whether it's a gambling addiction. And then the people around that individual, when they see that there's a problem and they intervene, they're actually going out of their way to help those people. And I can guarantee you, there are more cases of self-harm through history, either intentionally through suicide or unintentionally through alcoholism and gambling and drugs and so on and so forth, than there are stories about abuse in religion. Yet we tend to lose sight of that idea. So, thank goodness for the people that care about someone that's hurting themselves to step in and help them. Once again, getting back to the argument of why it is so important to be a part of a community.
So far we've been talking about these big picture things. I've got big questions and I feel like I'm going to not get answered. You talked about this, idea of bad actors in organized religion. But I think the deepest question that people have is that I'm going to lose a sense of myself. I will drown within this big collective sea and I won't be able to retain my individuality. And what do you guys think about that? Is that true?
I mean, I think it's a good point. I think this one, it's such an interesting question, right? It's like, if I participate in something that's collective, do I lose myself? If I participate in something structured, does that mean I didn't get to, I don't know, like maybe make decisions for myself or have my own individual thoughts? And especially when it comes to spirituality, I think that's a very like common question or something that people struggle with. If I think about it as, it's either I get to be individual or I get to be a part of a collective, or I'm an individual or I follow a structured path. The likelihood, again, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, is like if we are trying to take this rugged individualism, this rugged individual path, the likelihood that you're going to transform is very low. You need structure and a system to change and grow. If I think sometimes an individual path or an individual kind of view of spirituality, we might think, I'm seeking a spiritual experience. And so I want this experience and I need to find it myself. And sometimes maybe we do find that experience. And the experience can be transformative, but if I want to transform, I need it. I think you're most likely to get there if you have a structure. And so I guess the question is, I'm trying to safeguard my individuality, but which version of this individual am I safeguarding? I owe it to this individual to grow and change and transform. And so in order for me to get there, to become this other version of myself that I have in my mind, or I think that I'll gain through spirituality, a structured path is more likely to get you there. And so you have to kind of weigh what's most important to you and consider that, right? Like which individual am I trying to protect here? Or which individual am I trying to, safeguard here?
I agree. And I just want to go back to something that Dhawal, you said about, we have to dress the same. We have to kind of look the same. But there's an inherent hypocrisy that exists when people criticize organized religion or faith, any faith, whatever faith that is, in terms of, we have to dress the same. Well, that's never a requirement, number one. Number two, when it comes to dressing the same and identifying your allegiance or your alliance with whatever else it may be, say it's a football team. I have a lot of friends that are Dallas Cowboy fans. And the Cowboys are an American football team, and they all wear the same jersey when they're playing on the field. But if you look in the stands, most of the fans are wearing those jerseys. They're wearing those colors. And nobody ever really questions, hey, why are we all dressing the same? It's a way to kind of show your allegiance to the team is how you do it. And I tell my friends all the time, I'm like, look, man, you're wearing, a jersey, like the official player jersey when you're going to the game. But I can guarantee you, there's never going to be a time in the game when the coach looks up in the stands and asks you to come down and run the ball, right? You're never going to get to play on the Cowboys. So this idea of, I don't want to be a part of a, blind faith and blindly follow an organization. You already do to some degree. And whatever other allegiances you have, if you're a physician and you go to the hospital and you're working in an operative suite, you're wearing scrubs. You never really question, hey, why are our scrubs all the same color? You just do it because that's part of the culture of that place. So I don't think there's a problem with the idea that people of faith organizations have a certain code of conduct and when it comes to dress or anything like that. And then the second point I'd like to make is this idea of losing yourself. You're really not losing yourself. You're losing the untrained version of yourself, the unskilled version of yourself. You're losing the unenlightened version of yourself. We've already identified a group of people that want to tread a spiritual path. Organized religions will help guide you on that path to get the most out of it. So it's not a way to wash you away. It's a way to kind of wash off all the crud, all the crass elements, wash away all those edges to make you as smooth as possible so that you can hopefully achieve what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's a great way to close off this episode. Let's actually tie it all together. Why does organized religion matter? Quick answer from the two of you.
because you can't grow alone. You need real answers, and you need a system that actually sustains that change.
I think structured path leads to growth. It leads to transformation. And if I can surround myself with like-minded people, I'm likely to get to the outcomes I'm looking for and hopefully enjoy the journey as well.
Yeah. And the path can seem uncomfortable. The path can seem to be challenging you. It certainly challenges our conceptions of what spirituality is. But the longer you walk on this path, the more fulfilling it becomes and the more you grow internally. And I think that's the beauty of organized religion. That's the beauty of the path that we have been on our lives so far. And, we hope that through joining us on these episodes, you too get to go down this path along with us. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Dharmic Life. Please leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast. And I hope you'll join us again for another episode where we talk more about these topics about what it's like to walk on the spiritual path. Thank you and namaste.